Hi, I'm Zach, and I'm joined by my colleagues Craig and Pam. For the College Board's Advanced Placement, or AP, U.S. Government and Politics exam, students must know 15 required Supreme Court cases, stretching from the 1803 ruling in Marbury v. Madison to McDonald v. Chicago and Citizens United versus FEC in 2010. However, the exam also requires students to engage in what is called a free response question, or FRQ, that asks them to compare and contrast the information they already know about one of the required cases with a non-required case. The question, which begins with a 2-paragraph stimulus that describes the background and holding for the non-required case, asks students to do 3 things. First, Part A often asks students to identify a constitutional clause or principle that is relevant to both cases. Second, Part B often requires students to compare or contrast the 2 cases. And third, Part C likely requires students to apply the case's ruling to a political action or principle.
That sure is a lot of content and prep work. But luckily for all of you, we have a community of teacher experts willing to lend their expertise and insight to help your students demonstrate their knowledge of landmark Supreme Court cases. In this episode, we'll be joined by former CSPAN Classroom Teacher Fellow Ryan Werenka, who will share some of the review resources that he developed this past summer for you to use in your classroom with your students. So, whether you're already thinking about getting your students prepped for this spring's AP U.S. Government exam, or you just want to deepen their understanding of the judicial branch, stick around. We'll be right back.
Joining us today is Ryan Werenka, a teacher at Troy High School in Troy, Michigan. Ryan was a CSPAN Fellow this past summer, and he's currently a member of our classroom community cohort. Ryan, can we begin today by sharing with our listeners what you teach at Troy High School?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. This semester, I'm teaching 3 AP U.S. Government and Politics classes and 2 AP Comparative Government Politics classes. And then next semester, I'll be teaching all day 5 sections of AP U.S. Government. So it is my life.
Yeah, Ryan, Craig mentioned that you were a part of our summer fellowship program, which for our listeners who are not familiar with it, is a program that's open to social studies teachers in grades 6 through 12 who are familiar with C-SPAN Television Network's programs, use C-SPAN classroom resources in their classrooms, and would like to collaborate with our team for 4 weeks in July to develop new free resources for teachers to host on our classroom website. Each fellow receives a $1,000 stipend. Now, can you talk a little bit about your experience as a fellow for those educators who are tuned in and might be interested in applying?
Yes, and probably the best piece of advice that I can give to any person that's interested in applying is apply. It was such a phenomenal experience working with C-SPAN. I would highly recommend it. It was great. There were 4 other phenomenal teachers in my cohort, and we got to meet weekly and interact and collaborate with each other on our different projects. And so, again, it was just a phenomenal experience from that end. So I would definitely recommend it. And then the really great thing about it as well was that C-SPAN really does give you kind of a nudge, maybe in a direction to go. So mine, it was AP Government because that's the focus of my teaching. But then they kind of give you, okay, so focus on AP Government. They give you the flexibility and the freedom to start looking at where you want to develop resources and what type of resources you're interested in developing. And so I still have a notebook full of ideas of things that I think, hey, I could do this project or that project. But the biggest focus that I ended up with was review materials and writing free response questions, which I was really happy to, I think I have 9 of them completed at this point. So that was my focus.
I definitely have to echo about that subtle nudge that the C-SPAN classroom team offers fellows. For instance, when I was a fellow, I focused on state history resources. And a lot of those resources have a dual role in that I was teaching South Carolina history, so they were good for my classroom, but they're also useful in other classes across the country for other teachers, whether it's teaching U.S. Gov, U.S. history, so on and so forth. And what we've already heard, Ryan, from those resources you developed this last summer, a bunch of positive feedback. So I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about what those free response question resources or FRQ resources are and the significance of using them with your students?
Yeah, definitely. So for those unfamiliar with the AP U.S. Government Politics exam, there are 4 different types of free response questions. There's concept application, which is basically tell us what this is and how it works. There's a quantitative analysis, which is looking at a graph or a chart or a map and then gleaning information from it and using it to answer prompts. There's the Supreme Court cases or FRQs, which are again giving you a non-required case and giving you information, and you have to relate it to one of the 15 required cases that you are required to study. And then there's an argument essay, which is a whole different animal, but it's definitely one that there are a number of different prompts. It's writing a defensible claim and providing evidence from the documents and things like that. But with that, this past year in 2022, I actually graded the Supreme Court FRQ for the College Board, and was really, again, of a lot of the ones that I graded, kind of surprised at how many points students were missing, and that kind of stuck with me. And so then I looked back at AP Classroom for the resources that the College Board had developed, and there were a whopping 8 sample free response questions in AP Classroom, and then maybe a couple that were released from the previous year's exams. And so I looked at it, and then when I was looking through C-SPAN's materials, there are other prompts for other types of essays, but there really weren't any for the Supreme Court free response question. And so my goal was, I'm going to write as many questions as the AP as the College Board has in AP Classroom. And so now, actually, with the 9th question, C-SPAN actually has more practice free response questions available than the College Board does.
That's fantastic.
So with relation to the cases, how do you determine the cases that you focus on in the FRQs that you developed, and how do you incorporate them into your units of study in your classroom?
Typically what the College Board will do is they'll give you, there's a certain list of clauses that I think are really important. Like students will need to know, the Commerce Clause or the Supremacy Clause or the Equal Protection Clause. And then there's other civil liberties that are represented. So what I did is sort of reverse engineer it. I looked at, okay, these are the 15 cases that we need to know, and kind of what's the main crux of what the College Board would ask you about for each question. And then once I had that down, I started looking at, okay, well, what are interesting cases that are not required that students would have to read and interpret and understand, but then see how it's similar to those other cases. So I chose to write about a variety of different ones. I know, truth be told, one of my favorite Supreme Court cases, I know this is very nerdy, one of my favorite Supreme Court cases is McCullough v. Maryland, which there was no practice free response question on. So I said, I got to write that wrong. And I wrote one about that. And then some other non-required cases that I really enjoy that are favorites. Loving versus Virginia is near and dear to my heart. So in some instances, I did pick cases that were either fairly recent, like Mono Area School District versus BL, or the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And so I did have those in mind, as these would be interesting cases that the kids will enjoy, but then being able to relate to some of the important clauses.
Okay, so speaking of cases that are near and dear to your heart, Ryan, let's dive into some of the resources you created and take a look at an example or two. And the first one that we'll focus on is the landmark Supreme Court case, Loving v. Virginia. So we'll play a portion of a clip that you include in this FRQ resource that you created that features the Washington Post's Patricia Sullivan talking about it.
Mildred was a black woman in rural Virginia who fell in love with a white man in the 1950s. They were childhood sweethearts, grew up together, and eventually she became pregnant. They got married. This was a problem because in those days, Virginia did not allow blacks and whites to marry. Make a long story short, she and her husband eventually sued the state of Virginia, which resulted in a Supreme Court case which overturned prohibitions against biracial marriages in the United States.
So in the clip, we heard about Mildred Loving and the impetus of the Loving Supreme Court case, which ultimately overturned prohibitions against biracial marriages. With that said, Ryan, why did you pair Loving with the Brown v. Board of Education case for an FRQ?
Well, ultimately, Loving and Brown are both cases about equal protection. And so, again, looking at what kinds of clauses and what amendments the students need to know. The College Board tends to really like the 14th Amendment, as do I. I think the 14th Amendment is really important for them to know, and especially the Equal Protection Clause. And so, I thought that was a really kind of of the sample questions, that I wrote, one that I thought they would find interesting. Loving is really great for federalism as well. I think there's a lot of relevance to it, and there's relevance to it in the news recently with the Respect for Marriage Act that was passed, and links to Obergefell v. Hodges. So there's a lot of different things where, again, I could see the students being interested in Loving. And then, again, where they may have a background or a knowledge of Brown, they can see how the Equal Protection Clause could be applied in a lot of different scenarios, whether it's about desegregating schools or about being able to marry the person that you love. So, and truth be told, I'm in an interracial marriage, so that's part of the reason why Loving is near and dear to my heart. But I thought, again, the kids would really be, kids would all across the country would find that to be an interesting case.
So for listeners who are just hearing about these resources that you've developed, you've set up your FRQs with 3 questions that students are to consider when they're comparing the cases, and you've listed each document with parts A, B, and C. And I have the questions in front of me in case you need them, but can you walk us through what it is exactly that you're looking for in the students' responses when comparing the Loving case with Brown v. Board?
With writing these questions, one of the things that I thought was really important was also to include a rubric. And again, I tried to create the rubric very much like how the College Board would do this. So again, I modeled them very much after the rubrics that I had when I was grading those. And so again, with the prompts that you would look at for these, typically the first prompt is, again, looking at, well, what's kind of the clause or the main idea about this. So again, what I would hope for the Loving question is that, students would know, okay, I've got to know, equal protection of the law. And so on the rubric, it would basically spell out if you've put, that you're going to get the point. And then when we start getting into some of the other prompts, the B prompt is really worth 2 points. And so, again, that's demonstrating specifics about each individual case. And so you would have to know, here are the, demonstrable things that you would have to have in order to get the point. And then for the third one, that's one, again, where I modeled it based off of all of the sample prompts that the College Board has given us, which is, knowing if you were from an interest group, how would you, handle this? Or if you were to have an amicus brief, or if you were to have, be a member of Congress, how could you respond to this? So there's a lot of different threads on all of the different FRQs. In this one, again, it was the Loving one. It was about how Supreme Court justices might interpret the Constitution. So in that instance, again, looking at where they could have disagreements on how they would interpret the Constitution, how they would interpret differences with race and ethnicity. And so, again, it would be a demonstration of understanding, how the Supreme Court could change decisions on voting rights or on university admissions, but basically race-based decision-making.
Yeah, and so looking at the structure of the resources and through your teacher lens, can you talk about the effectiveness of this review tool that you developed? And in thinking about new teachers who are listening to this, or teachers who might be new to these, any tips on how they'd be able to incorporate this FRQ or introduce it to their students?
Yeah, definitely. I think, the more, my philosophy has always been with the AP US Gov exam, half of the students' score is their writing. And so I've tried to put over the last 15 or 16 years a lot of different sample prompts. Some of them are ones that the College Board's released, and some of them are ones that I write. And I just want them to start to understand, here's the level of thinking that you have to hit, and then also understanding some of the basic rules for writing pre-response questions. I've learned little tips and tricks through AP conferences. Like one of them is, I read up on the board, remember, APBS, which they kind of chuckle at because they think it means something different, but it means answer the prompt and be specific. So they want to know specific elements to the answers for the questions. And then another one is RSVP, which is restate the language of the question in your answer and vanish the pronouns. Don't just say, they could do this or it does that. the College Board readers need to know, who are you talking about? What are you talking about? So the more sample questions you can give students, the better. And I get it. There's a lot of times that you'd say, I don't have the time to grade. I've got 150 students coming up next semester. I don't have time to sit and grade multiple, FRQs with 150 students. So sometimes I give them in groups, or sometimes I might give them a portion of one of the answers instead of all 3 prompts. But just the more opportunity, and we'll do them in large groups too, but the more opportunities you can do to give them to see these questions and to see how to write them, I've seen a translation in better scores for my students just from having those practice opportunities.
It's definitely critical too, as you're developing these FRQs, to allow for that flexibility for teachers, however they choose to employ these resources. So definite kudos to you in being creative on how to address these cases. But shifting gears a little bit, changing cases from one that's near and dear to your heart to another one, you mentioned as we were preparing for this episode that you were working on the Cooper v. Aaron case with your students this week. For our listeners, can you just give us a general gist and overview of the major tenets of that case?
Yeah, so Cooper versus Aaron, I think, a lot of American history classes will be teaching the crisis at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And again, when we're talking about Brown v. Board of Education, and there's Brown 2, which talks about desegregating with all deliberate speed, there was the court order in Little Rock to desegregate Central High School. And so basically, the governor of Arkansas didn't want to do it. President Eisenhower mobilized the 101st Airborne to escort students to school, the 9 black students that have been admitted to Central High School. And basically at the end of the school year, the 101st Airborne was redeployed, and the governor of Arkansas went back to the courts and said, hey, this last year was just crazy and it was super disruptive, and the federal government's not here anymore to escort these students. Can we effectively resegregate our schools and then go back to their initial plan, which was they wanted to do this in a couple of years, couple of further years down the line, to then desegregate, and the federal courts basically said no, and so the state of Arkansas doesn't have the ability to resegregate schools. Federal law takes precedent. So giving students some of those examples of here's where Brown went, right, to a case like Cooper v. Aaron, I think is interesting. But then it gets into, another really important clause that students need to know, which is the supremacy clause. So when there is that disagreement between the federal government and the states, if there's a compelling national interest, which Brown v. Board of Education was, the federal government wins. So it was interesting to do that, but then to tie it into, McCullough v. Maryland, which again is another favorite of mine, and there's never been an FRQ on that one yet, but on that case. But again, where McCullough v. Maryland was very much about the constitutionality of the bank and the supremacy of the federal government over the state of Maryland, I thought it was kind of an easy tie-in between those two.
Excellent. Yeah. So before we go any further, we wanted to quickly set up the significance of that case, McCullough v. Maryland. And to do so, we have a clip from law professor Mark Killenbeck of the University of Arkansas. And here he's detailing why the decision in McCullough was significant in solidifying the federal government's ability to take actions not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and the significance of that decision in restricting state actions against what is deemed the legitimate use of federal power. Let's listen.
Well, it's a core piece of the current constitutional landscape. We talked about that earlier in terms of the deference to congressional judgments about what is wise policy. Certainly the notion that the states may not impair the operation of the federal government by taxation or anything else is very important. It's just a central part of the assumption that we have what we call a compound republic in certain areas when it exercises its power properly. The Supreme Court has told us that the federal government is supreme.
Okay, so Ryan, when you assign this FRQ review to your students later this week, 2 things come to mind. What will you be looking for in their responses? And we were wondering, how have your students been receptive to the FRQ practices? Are they finding them helpful? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. When and I've started assigning, we're near the end of our semester here, but one of the things that I look to through all the different types of FRQs that I assign are they making progress with their writing? Are they understanding those rules? Are they able to make those connections? Do they understand, how many points each question is worth? And I've just seen tremendous growth from my students, and it's really neat to just hand them back that paper, and then when they see those additional plus marks, maybe on that first FRQ that I give them, they get maybe 1 or 0 plus marks, indicating that they got the point. And now at this point in the semester, they've really kind of gotten it down. And a lot of them are in a really good writing rhythm, and they are understanding kind of the depth of the specificity that they have to hit on these cases. And so, you would expect that, okay, hey, today we're going to do a practice, free response question, that there would be groaning and eye rolls and, things. But they actually, I think, legitimately look forward to it. So, and I think, again, they know that these are going to help them, and that's really all that my students are interested in. If they understand, if it's going to help me to be better prepared, they're all for it.
Well, and speaking about preparing students, we currently have what you mentioned, the 8 FRQ practices from College Board, influenced with C-SPAN clips, and then the additional one that you developed in the last few weeks. Leads me to this next question. Are there any other FRQ practices that are in the hopper that you are planning on working on for us to feature on our featured resources page?
There definitely are, with our break coming up here after this Friday, so I'll be on break for the next 2 weeks. There definitely are. I've thought about some for maybe Baker versus like a gerrymandering one, Baker versus Carr. There's a few other things that I'll look to of the mandatory Supreme Court cases and see which ones are there, maybe not questions for, either on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN or on the College Board, and I will try to fill those gaps. So I'd love to get a couple more done, probably 2 or 3 more done still this school year prior to the AP exam.
Wow. Yeah. And Ryan, as we start to wrap up this week's episode, we wanted to give you a final word. So are there any other related resources that you've found useful with your students that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, definitely from the C-SPAN classroom, if I can toot the horn of C-SPAN classroom, there are definitely a lot of really great bell ringers that are there. I know I've used those in my AP US Gov class and in my AP Comparative Gov class. I know that's been a really nice find to be able to use some of the Comparative Gov things, because, again, there's not a ton of resources, from even the College Board on that. So being able to use those has been really helpful. But those have been really helpful. The lesson plans always give really good ideas. And then, again, there's just some other things in each of the, on the AP Government page on C-SPAN Classroom. There are a lot of really beneficial lesson ideas. The classroom deliberations are a really great resource as well, which, again, I think is something that's an underutilized resource, and one that I, had told myself at the beginning of the year I really want to use those more, but that's something that unfortunately hasn't happened this semester. But I actually have had my classes working pretty extensively on their student cam projects. And again, that would be another thing I would recommend looking into for other teachers. The C-SPAN student cam documentary competition is a really great opportunity for students to really put together basically an essay, but in video form. And I've actually found a lot of really great links between the student cam rubric of what the students have to produce with the argument essay that they have to write for the AP US Gov exam. So that was kind of one of the easy selling points to my students. Like, I know this sounds crazy. This is going to help you to also be a better writer for that question. And we're going to be introducing all of those elements coming up after we come back from our holiday break. But again, having worked on the student cam project for the past several weeks, I think they'll be really in a good space to do well on those.
Ryan, that's terrific, mate. And we really want to thank you again for being such a wonderful member of our classroom community. And we appreciate your time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
From analyzing the prompt to planning a response, and from writing the explanation to proofreading for accuracy, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears often goes into preparing for and completing the AP US Government exam, both for the teacher and for the student. But we hope that the resources we shared in this episode will prove fruitful to you and your class this spring and beyond. Make sure to stay on the lookout for upcoming AP US Government and Politics Cram for the Exam review show, which typically airs the Saturday before the test.
And you'll find all the resources that we highlighted in this episode and more on our featured resources page at www.cspan.org/classroom. And if you would ever like to connect with our team to learn more about what we have to offer to teachers and students, please email us anytime at educate@c-span.org.
And that's it for this week. Please remember to like and follow our podcast wherever you listen so you don't miss our next episode. Until then, thanks for joining us.